let's continue on and talk about the decomposition of potassium chlorate. So a lot of problems are going to be given to you with the nomenclature or the name of a chemical compound, and from that you need to be able to immediately write a formula. So from the correct IUPAC name, we can construct a chemical formula, and then from that chemical formula, we can write a balanced reaction. So potassium chlorate, remember that chlorate implies there's chlorine present, and 8 refers to the fact that it's negatively charged and includes oxygen, or it's an oxyanion. Now, there are several oxygen-containing chlorine oxyanions. So I'll write out 4 of them here, just so that you can see all the names at once. You can have 1, 2, 3, or 4 oxygens bound.